William Harrington was a billionaire who controlled everything in his world, except the quiet maid who kept slipping away with red eyes and no real explanation. He told himself it wasn't his business. He told himself that right up until the night he followed her across Chicago and walked into a hospital hallway that changed both their lives forever. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The Harrington estate sat on 11 acres of manicured land just outside Chicago, and everything about it was intentional. The hedges were trimmed to the exact same height every Thursday morning. The gravel on the driveway was raked into neat parallel lines after any rainfall. The flower beds along the front path were rotated seasonally according to a schedule that had been typed up and laminated years ago, hanging in the groundskeeper's shed like a sacred document. Nothing about the property happened by accident. Nothing was left to chance. That was the way William Harrington wanted it. He was a man who had built a technology investment empire, not through luck, but through a relentless, almost frightening ability to observe patterns. He could look at a startup's financial model and spot a flaw in 3 minutes that a team of accountants had missed for weeks. He could walk into a boardroom and read the energy before a single word was spoken. His mind worked like a machine, processing, filtering, sorting everything around him into categories. Useful or not useful, honest or dishonest, reliable or unreliable. That same mind applied itself to everything, including the people who worked in his home. He had 17 household staff members. He knew all of their names, all of their schedules, and most of their personal circumstances in the broad strokes. He knew that his head housekeeper, Patricia, had a son in community college and always requested Sundays off. He knew that the groundskeeper, Raymond, had a bad left knee that flared up in the cold and would never admit it. He knew these things not because he pried, but because he watched. He had always watched. And for the past several months, Lydia Brooks had been the one he watched most. She was a maid, one of 4, hired 2 years ago through the agency he used for all domestic staff placements. Her record was spotless. Not a single complaint, not a single missed shift, not a single item broken or misplaced. The other maids sometimes gathered in the kitchen during their afternoon break to talk about small things, television, weekend plans, neighborhood gossip. Lydia never joined. She wasn't cold about it. She would smile when spoken to. She would answer a question if asked. But she never lingered. She finished one task and moved immediately to the next, as if standing still cost her something she couldn't afford to spend. William had noticed that about her early on. The quiet efficiency. The way she moved through a room like she was trying not to disturb the air. But what he had started noticing more recently was something else. Every few days, sometimes twice a week, Lydia would leave the estate earlier than her scheduled end time. She always arranged it quietly, always made sure her work was completed or handed off to someone else before she left. She never made a scene about it. She simply approached Patricia, said something brief, and slipped out. The reason she gave, every single time, was errands. In itself, that meant nothing. People had lives outside of work. Staff had obligations. William understood that. What made it stand out to him was the look on her face when she left. It wasn't the relaxed expression of someone heading out to pick up groceries or run to the post office. Her jaw was tight. Her eyes had a focused, slightly distant quality, as if she was already somewhere else in her mind before her body had caught up. And then there were the red eyes. Twice now he had seen her return from one of these early departures, and both times, though she had clearly composed herself before walking back through the door, her eyes were swollen and pink at the edges. She had been crying. Not recently, but recently enough that her face still carried the evidence of it. William had trained himself over decades not to get pulled into other people's emotional states. Sentiment was a distraction, but the pattern here was undeniable, and patterns were something he could never ignore. One evening in early November, he was walking toward his study when he heard her voice drifting from the narrow hallway near the east wing. He slowed without meaning to. Her voice was low, but the urgency in it cut through the quiet of the corridor. "Please," she was saying, "just keep him stable until I get there." A pause. She was listening to whoever was on the other end. "I understand. I'm leaving now. Just please, just keep him stable." William had stopped walking entirely. He was standing near the corner of the hallway, out of sight, and he stayed still as her voice dropped lower. He couldn't make out the next few words. Then there was silence, and the sound of footsteps moving quickly toward the main entrance. He stepped forward just as Lydia turned the corner, and for a brief, startled second they were face to face. She stopped immediately. Her phone was still in her hand. Her expression shifted. Not guilt, exactly, but the look of someone caught in a private moment they hadn't wanted witnessed. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, and her voice was steady, but her eyes weren't. "I apologize if I disturb you. I need to step out. There's a personal matter." "Of course," William said. She nodded once and walked past him toward the door, pulling on her coat as she went. He stood in the hallway for a long moment after she left, staring at nothing in particular. Keep him stable. His mind began doing what it always did. It began sorting possibilities. Financial trouble was the most obvious explanation. Debt collectors, loan arrangements gone wrong, or perhaps a legal situation. In his world, people buried things. Everyone had something. The secrets people kept were usually mundane, but sometimes they were the kind that could be leveraged, and William had learned a long time ago to know what was going on inside his own house. The next morning he called his security chief, a quiet and thorough man named Garrett, into his office. "I want you to pull the schedule records for Lydia Brooks," William said. "Cross-reference her early departures against any patterns. Days of the week, frequency, how long she's gone." Garrett nodded and wrote something in his small notebook. "But don't dig into her personal life yet," William added. "Just the schedule. Nothing more than that." That was unusual. William typically authorized full reviews when something raised a flag. Garrett noted it, but said nothing. Over the next 4 days, William kept his attention on the normal rhythms of the house. Business calls, investment reviews, a board meeting in the city. His son Daniel was in the middle of a rough patch at school and had been retreating to his room in the evenings rather than eating dinner with his father, and William hadn't pushed. He rarely pushed. It was easier to let things sit. Then the call happened again, and this time he was in the same room. He had been reviewing documents in his office, a large room on the ground floor with tall windows overlooking the back garden, when Lydia knocked and entered to clean. He had waved her in without looking up. She worked quietly, as she always did, barely a sound except the soft movement of the cloth over surfaces. William was absorbed in a contract review and had almost forgotten she was there when he heard the sound of something hitting the floor. He looked up. Lydia was standing near the side table, her hand still extended from where she had been holding a glass vase. The vase was on the floor, intact, but she wasn't looking at it. She was staring at the phone in her other hand with an expression he could only describe as dread. Her face had gone completely still, the way a person goes still when they're trying to absorb information that hasn't fully landed yet. Then she was moving. She set the phone down on the table, picked up the vase without even glancing at it, and said, "I'm very sorry, sir. I need to go. I apologize. I'll make sure everything is finished before I go," William said simply. She was out of the room before he finished speaking. He sat at his desk for a moment. Then he stood up, walked to the window, and watched as Lydia crossed the driveway below at nearly a run, pulling out her phone again as she went. He was in his car 11 minutes later. He hadn't planned it. He would think about that later, how uncharacteristic it was for a man who planned everything. But something had moved him out of his chair and through the house and into the garage with a momentum that bypassed his usual deliberation. He kept a full car length back as he followed her through the city, staying in the right lane, letting other vehicles drift between them when possible. She drove with focus, slightly above the speed limit, taking the interstate south and then cutting through a neighborhood he didn't know well. She pulled into the parking lot of Mercy General Hospital, a large public medical center on the south side of the city. William pulled into a spot across the street and sat with the engine idling. He watched Lydia run from her car into the main entrance without looking back. She didn't stop at the front desk, which meant she knew exactly where she was going. She disappeared through a set of interior doors and was gone. William sat in his car for a long time. A hospital, not a debt collector, not a lawyer's office. A hospital. He got out eventually and crossed the street. He didn't go to admissions. He walked through the lobby slowly, the way someone might walk if they were visiting and had a moment to spare, glancing down the corridors that branched off the main hallway. He found her in the third one, standing near a bank of chairs halfway down the hall, speaking quietly into her phone. Her back was half turned to him. She didn't see him. What he saw stopped him completely. She was crying, not loudly. There was no performance in it, no reaching for comfort from the handful of people nearby. She was simply standing there with tears running down her face, her free hand pressed flat against the wall beside her as if she needed it for balance, speaking words too quiet for him to make out. Her maid's uniform, she hadn't had time to change, was slightly wrinkled from the drive. Her shoulders were shaking in the small, controlled way of someone who has learned not to let grief take up too much space. William stood at the end of the hallway and watched her. He had seen grief before. He had lived inside it for 3 years since his wife died. But there was something about seeing it expressed so quietly, so without audience, by a woman who always presented herself to the world as composed and competent. It unsettled him in a way he didn't immediately have words for. He stepped back before she could turn around. He moved along the wall until he had a sight line down a different corridor, one that gave him a partial view of a room near where Lydia had been standing. Through the narrow glass panel in the door, he could see a bed. On it lay a young man hooked to several monitors. A nurse moved around him with practiced efficiency. Lydia came around the corner and pushed through the door of that room. William watched through the glass. He couldn't hear anything, but he could see her cross to the bed. He could see her take the young man's hand in both of hers. He could see her lean close and say something near his face, her head bowed. Then a doctor appeared from the other end of the hallway and approached the room, and William stepped back again, moving quietly toward the lobby. He sat in his car for 45 minutes before driving home. He came back the next day. He told himself it wasn't something he had decided. It was simply that he had a meeting in that part of the city and the hospital was nearby. But the meeting was at 2 in the afternoon, and he arrived at Mercy General at 9 in the morning, which meant the justification wasn't entirely honest, and William Harrington was, above almost everything else, honest with himself. He went in through the main entrance and kept to the periphery of the space, avoiding the main corridors until he understood the layout better. The wing where Lydia had gone was on the second floor. He found a waiting area near the elevator with a clear view of the hallway that led to that section of rooms. He was there for 20 minutes before he heard her voice. She came off the elevator, speaking quietly with a woman in hospital administrator's clothing, middle-aged, efficient-looking, carrying a clipboard. Their voices were low, but the hallway had that particular still quality that lets sound travel further than it should. The next treatment cycle, the administrator was saying, has to be scheduled within the next 30 days or we lose the window for the current protocol. I understand, Lydia said. I'm working on it. Ms. Brooks, I want to be straightforward with you. The remaining balance for the next cycle is... I know what it is, Lydia said quietly. I know the number. I just need a little more time. There was a pause. The administrator's voice softened slightly. We have support programs. There are. I've applied to all of them, Lydia said. I'm on the waiting list for 2. I'm managing it. They moved past his position and down the hall. William remained still. He spent the next hour in that waiting area. And in that hour, he learned more than he had expected to. He watched Lydia come and go from the room 3 times. Between her visits, a young nurse came out and updated the whiteboard near the door with a patient name, Marcus Brooks. The nurse spoke briefly with another staff member near the station, and though their conversation was not for him, it drifted clearly down the quiet hall. The seizure last night was bad, the nurse said. He's stable now, but Dr. Carter wants to move up the evaluation. How's the sister doing? The nurse glanced in the direction of the room. She's always here. I don't think she sleeps. William had been a man of data and observation for 30 years. What he was building in his mind now was a picture assembled from small pieces. The hospital visits, the red eyes, the early departures, the administrator's conversation about balances and treatment windows. But data didn't fully explain the weight he felt settling into his chest as he sat in that plastic waiting room chair and looked at the door to Marcus Brooks's room. That afternoon, he made a quiet inquiry through his office. His assistant, who was accustomed to unusual research requests, compiled a basic report by the following morning. It confirmed what the overheard conversations had suggested. Marcus Brooks, 23 years old, admitted to Mercy General 7 months ago with a progressive neurological condition. Rare, serious, and expensive to treat. Lydia Brooks, listed as next of kin. Employer listed as Harrington Domestic Services. William read the report twice and set it aside. He went back to the hospital 3 days later, on a Thursday afternoon, and this time he stayed longer. He found a different waiting area, one near the neurology ward that gave him a less direct but more sustainable vantage point. He was reading on his phone, or appearing to, when Lydia came through from the direction of the elevators. She sat in a chair across the room and didn't notice him. She was still in her work clothes, which meant she had come straight from the mansion. She had a paper cup of coffee that she set on the chair beside her without drinking it, and she sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes pointed toward the floor in the particular way of someone whose mind is somewhere completely else. She looked exhausted, not the temporary exhaustion of a long day, but the deeper kind, the kind that settles into a person's face and posture over months and doesn't lift with sleep anymore. The shadows under her eyes were significant. The small tension in her jaw was the kind of thing a person develops when they spend a lot of time holding themselves together. A door opened down the hall, and a young man's voice said, clearly and warmly, "Hey, you don't have to make that face. I'm not dead yet." Lydia's face broke into a smile so fast and so genuine it looked like a completely different person for a second. She stood up and walked quickly to the doorway. "You're not supposed to be sitting up," she said, but she was already laughing quietly. "The nurse said I could sit up," Marcus said. His voice was thin, but there was real energy in it. She said, and I quote, "You are allowed to be a human being." "Don't get comfortable," Lydia said, and her voice had shifted entirely, the weight in it gone, replaced with something light and teasing. "I'll tell Dr. Carter you're being difficult." "I'm delightful," Marcus said. "Dr. Carter loves me." Dr. Carter is too professional to say what she actually thinks. William could hear the smile in Marcus's voice when he responded, "You look tired, Lydia." A pause. "I'm Phoenix. You're always fine." Another pause, softer now. "Come sit with me. Stop standing in the doorway like you're about to run." The door closed gently. William sat quietly for a long moment. He looked down at his phone, at the screen that had gone dark while he wasn't paying attention. Then he looked back at the closed door. He had spent the past 2 days reviewing what he knew. Lydia worked at the mansion 5 days a week. He had confirmed through Garrett's schedule review that she also worked 3 evenings a week at a restaurant in the city. He hadn't known about the second job until the report. 2 jobs, a sick brother, and medical bills that the administrator had described as significant enough to warrant a very direct conversation. The next morning, he spoke briefly with a contact at a medical research institute, asking general questions about neurological treatment programs and what the cost structure typically looked like for experimental protocols. The numbers he received were not surprising to him as a man who had spent years in health tech investment, but they hit differently now than they would have 2 weeks ago. Medial, the kind of treatment that could help Marcus cost millions over a full course. Lydia was working herself into the ground for what amounted, against those numbers, to a rounding error. He thought about that all afternoon. That evening, late, he drove back to the hospital. He wasn't entirely sure why. He sat in the parking lot for a while, and then he went inside, and he walked through the second-floor hallway until he reached the neurology ward. The ward was quiet at that hour. The lights were dimmed. Most of the visitors were gone. He found Lydia in the family consultation room near the end of the hall, sitting across a small table from a woman with a name badge identifying her as part of the hospital's finance department. There were papers spread across the table between them. Lydia's posture was straight, but her hands, folded in front of her, were pressing against each other tightly enough that the knuckles were lighter than the rest of her skin. He couldn't hear the conversation through the glass panel in the door, but he could read enough. The finance woman was pointing to something on a form. Lydia was nodding. Then she picked up a pen. He watched her start a sign. His hand moved to the door handle before he fully thought about it, and then he stopped himself. He stood there for a moment with his hand on the handle and then stepped back. Walking in would change everything. He didn't know yet what he wanted to change, or how, or whether he had any right to insert himself into this at all. Lydia signed the paper. She set the pen down carefully. The finance woman gathered the pages and said something. Lydia nodded again. Her expression, even through the glass, even in the dimmed light of the corridor, was the expression of someone who has just done something they will spend years paying for and knows it. William walked back through the ward and down the stairs and out into the cold November night. He sat in his car without starting the engine for a long time. The parking lot was nearly empty. A few lights burned in hospital windows above him. Somewhere in one of those rooms, a young man who had made his sister laugh with the voice of someone too stubborn to stop fighting was sleeping with machines tracking every beat of his heart. William had built everything in his life on the principle that problems could be solved with the right resources and the right plan. He had never had a shortage of either. What he had had a shortage of for 3 years now was any problem that mattered to him personally enough to engage with it fully. He thought about his wife, about the last 2 years of her illness and the resources he had thrown at it, the specialists, the experimental programs, the private research teams. He had done everything money could do, and it hadn't been enough. And afterward, he had carried that failure the way he carried everything, quietly, completely alone. Marcus Brooks had the same enemy that had taken Eleanor from him. A different illness, different mechanics, but the same type of adversary, the kind that worked silently inside the body's most essential system, taking things away in increments that were almost invisible until they weren't. Lydia was fighting that enemy with what she had, which was her time, her body, and a debt that would outlast the fight itself if nothing changed. William started the engine. He drove home through the dark, empty streets, and by the time he pulled into the Harrington driveway, the thought that had been forming quietly for days had finally taken full shape. He didn't know yet exactly what it would look like. He didn't know what it would require or what it would cost beyond the obvious. What he knew was this: he had the resources that the situation needed, and for the first time in 3 years, something had cut through the careful distance he had kept from the world and made him feel the weight of another person's life like it was pressing directly against his chest. He sat in the parked car in the dark garage for another minute. Then he went inside to start making calls. The calls took most of that night and the better part of the following morning. William sat at the desk in his private study, a room that most of the staff had never seen the inside of, with 3 phones and a legal pad covered in notes, working through a network of contact he had built over 25 years in technology investment. Medical researchers, hospital administrators, biotech executives, university department heads. He wasn't asking for anything yet. He was listening, asking questions, building a picture with the care and patience he brought to every major decision he had ever made. By the time pale winter light began to come through the study windows, he had the shape of what he needed to understand. Marcus's condition, a rare progressive neurological disorder affecting the peripheral and central nervous systems, fell into a category of illness that the mainstream medical community had historically underfunded. Not because it wasn't serious, but because it was rare enough that the market for treatment was small, which meant pharmaceutical investment was limited, which meant research moved slowly, which meant the people who had it suffered longer than they should have. William knew how those calculations worked. He had sat in rooms where they were made. There was, however, one program that had produced genuinely promising results. A team at a research hospital in Boston had developed an experimental protocol, a combination of targeted gene therapy and nerve regeneration treatment, that had shown significant effectiveness in early trials. The results were real. The science was solid. But the program was operating on a fractured funding base, pulling from 3 different grants that were all due for renewal, and the team lead had been quietly approaching private investors for months with limited success. The lead researcher's name was Dr. Nathan Voss. William had met him once, 3 years ago, at a conference on biotech funding. He hadn't thought about him since. He thought about him now. He didn't call Dr. Voss that morning. He needed to speak with someone closer to Marcus's actual case first. He needed Dr. Evelyn Carter. Getting a private meeting with a senior neurologist at a public hospital without going through the standard referral process required a particular kind of approach. Not pressure, which rarely worked well with physicians and tended to produce resistance, but genuine professional context offered through the right channel. William asked his assistant to reach out to the hospital's research liaison office and request a meeting between himself and Dr. Carter regarding a private philanthropic inquiry related to neurological research. He used his foundation letterhead, a small charitable arm of his company that had funded medical technology grants in the past, mostly for PR purposes. This time he meant it. Dr. Carter agreed to meet him 4 days later. In the meantime, the house continued its rhythms. The hedges were trimmed. The gravel was raked. The staff went about their days in the quiet, organized way that the Harrington estate demanded of everyone who worked within it. And William watched Lydia differently now. He wasn't sure when the shift had completed itself, somewhere between the parking lot at Mercy General and the end of his night of phone calls, but the category she occupied in his mind had changed. She was no longer a data point, not a pattern to be analyzed for risk. She was a person whose story he now knew, and that knowledge had weight to it that his usual emotional distance couldn't quite neutralize. He noticed things he hadn't let himself notice before. The way she moved through the kitchen after arriving for her shift, always checking first that everything was in order before beginning, as if she needed the reassurance that the world was still organized. The way she carried herself when she was tired, not slumping, but moving with a careful deliberateness that looked like effort from the inside, but probably read as composure from the outside. He had read it as composure for 2 years. Now he understood it was something harder than that. He also noticed his son noticing him. Daniel Harrington was 16 and had been 16 for several months in a way that felt, to William, more like a statement than a birthday. Since Eleanor's death, the boy had retreated into a version of himself that was quieter, more contained, and consistently at an angle to whatever William offered. Not hostile, they didn't fight. They simply occupied parallel spaces within the same house without much intersection, like two objects sharing an orbit who had long since stopped expecting to touch. On a Wednesday afternoon, William was standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee, staring at the garden without seeing it, when Daniel came in and went to the refrigerator. Daniel got what he was after, closed the door, and turned around. He looked at his father, then followed the direction of William's gaze across the kitchen to where Lydia was working near the far counter. "You've been doing that a lot," Daniel said. "Doing what?" "Looking at her like you're trying to figure something out." William turned his attention to his coffee. "I'm not looking at anything." "Okay," Daniel said, in the tone that meant he didn't believe it, but wasn't interested in arguing. He moved toward the door. "She has a brother," William said. "He's sick." Daniel stopped. He turned back. "Sick how?" "Seriously." William set his cup down on the counter. "She's been managing it alone for a while." Daniel looked at Lydia's back, then back at his father. Something in his expression shifted. Not quite surprise, but the particular recalibration of someone whose understanding of a situation has just changed. "Does she need help?" "I'm looking into it." Daniel stood there for another moment, and then he nodded slowly and left. It was, William reflected, the longest exchange of substance they had managed in several months. 3 days later, Lydia rushed out of the mansion again in the early evening. This time, William didn't follow immediately. He sat in his study for 20 minutes, going through his notes, and then he got in the car. When he arrived at Mercy General, the ward was in a controlled state of heightened activity. A nurse moved quickly past the elevator with a card. 2 doctors spoke quietly near the station at the end of the hall, their voices stripped of everything except clinical focus. William understood the register. He had spent enough time in hospitals during Eleanor's illness to know the specific frequency that a ward shifts to when something has happened. He found out from the information board near the nurse's station, which listed Marcus Brooks's room number with a status notation that hadn't been there on his previous visits. A seizure. Severe. Stabilized 40 minutes ago. Lydia was in the family waiting room adjacent to the ward. She was sitting with her elbows on her knees and her face in her hands. She wasn't crying, or she had stopped by then. She was simply still in the way a person goes still when they have expended everything they have and are waiting for the world to tell them what comes next. William went to the nurse's station and asked for Dr. Carter. Dr. Carter was a tall woman in her mid-40s with the kind of measured, direct manner that came from spending a career delivering difficult information with precision and care. She looked at William with mild professional assessment when he introduced himself. "Mr. Harrington," she said, "we have a meeting scheduled for next week." "I know," he said. "I apologize for coming without arrangement. I was already on my way." It wasn't entirely true, but it was close enough. "Can we speak privately?" She gave him 5 minutes in a small consultation room off the hallway. He didn't waste the time. He told her directly that he had become aware of Marcus Brooks's case through a private channel. He didn't specify what, and that he was interested in understanding the full scope of available treatment options. He asked about the Boston research program. He asked about Dr. Voss's protocol. Dr. Carter's professional composure didn't change, but her attention sharpened considerably. "You know about the Voss program," she said. "I know it's the best currently available option for this type of presentation," William said. "I also know it's underfunded and that the waiting list is effectively determined by who can pay." "That's a simplified version of a complicated situation," Dr. Carter said carefully. "I'm not criticizing the system," William said. "I'm asking what it would take to change the outcome for this specific patient." A pause. Dr. Carter looked at him for a moment with the evaluating attention of someone deciding how much of what they are thinking is appropriate to say aloud. "Marcus Brooks needs to begin treatment within the next 30 to 45 days, she said finally. "The program in Boston could accept him, in theory, but the cost of a full treatment course is—" "I've looked into the numbers," William said. "Then you know it's beyond the family's means by several orders of magnitude." "Yes." Another pause. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Harrington?" "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "I wanted to understand what was real before I decided anything." He stood. "Thank you for your time, doctor. Keep our scheduled meeting." He left the consultation room and walked back down the hall. He passed the family waiting room without stopping. Through the half-open door, he could see Lydia still in the same chair, her hands now folded in her lap, looking at nothing in particular with the specific exhaustion of someone who has been on duty for so long that the line between resting and waiting has dissolved entirely. He kept walking. He drove home through streets that were beginning to collect the first thin layer of winter frost and thought about his wife, about the last experimental program they had tried for Eleanor, which had come 18 months too late, about what it felt like to sit in rooms exactly like the one Lydia was sitting in now and understand that the difference between survival and loss was not effort or love or willingness, but money, and the access money could purchase. He hadn't been able to change that for Eleanor. He could change it here. By the time he pulled into the Harrington driveway, the decision that had been forming for a week was fully formed. He simply needed to figure out exactly how to build it. The call with Dr. Nathan Voss lasted 2 hours. William made it on a Saturday morning from his study, the door closed, the house quiet. He had reviewed Dr. Voss's published research the night before, 3 papers and a grant proposal, and he came to the conversation prepared in the way he always came to important conversations, knowing more than the other person expected him to know. Dr. Voss was cautious at first. Researchers who had spent years chasing private funding learned a specific kind of wariness, the ability to recognize quickly whether an expression of interest was real or performative. William spent the first 20 minutes of the call demonstrating that he had actually read the research, that he understood the mechanism of the treatment, and that his questions were substantive rather than decorative. After that, Dr. Voss's caution gave way to something closer to carefully contained excitement. The program had capacity, Dr. Voss explained. The science was ready. What it lacked was the funding infrastructure to expand beyond its current tiny cohort of patients. The 3 grants keeping it alive were all up for renewal in the spring, and preliminary signs on 2 of them were not encouraging. If the funding gap wasn't closed, the program would contract, not expand, and several patients currently in the pipeline would lose their treatment window. What would it take to put the program on stable footing for 5 years? William asked. Dr. Voss gave him a number. William wrote it on the legal pad in front of him, looked at it for a moment, and then asked what it would take to endow the program permanently, to remove the grant dependency entirely, establish the research on an independent financial foundation, and expand its patient capacity to 20 annually rather than the current 4. There was a long silence on the other end of the call. That's a significantly larger number, Dr. Voss said. I understand. Tell me what it is. Dr. Voss told him. William wrote that number down too, directly below the first one, and studied them both. Give me 2 weeks, William said. I'll come to Boston. After the call, he sat at his desk for a while without moving. The numbers were large but not difficult. Not for him. Not the way they were impossible for Lydia. What he was deciding was not whether he could do it, but whether he should structure it as he was considering. Anonymously, at least initially, with no connection drawn back to himself. No levity. No expectation of return. No name attached. In his professional life, anonymous philanthropy was unusual. He gave publicly because public giving served purposes, tax structure, corporate image, stakeholder relationships. Giving with no name attached served nothing except the purpose itself. He found, somewhat to his own surprise, that this was exactly what he wanted. But the condition he set for himself was clear. Lydia must not know. Not yet. Maybe not ever. If she knew, it changed the nature of what he was doing in a way he couldn't fully articulate but understood instinctively. It became a transaction, something she owed him, something that altered the balance between them in his home and in her mind. He didn't want that. He wanted her brother to live. He wanted her to be able to sleep. He wanted the particular exhaustion he had watched accumulate in her face over weeks to start moving in the other direction. That was all. It was, he recognized, a strange thing for a man like him to want. He filed the strangeness and moved forward. On Sunday evening, he found Daniel in the television room. Not watching the television, just sitting on the couch in the blue light of it with his phone face down on the cushion beside him. It was the look of a person who had been thinking and had run out of productive directions to think in. William came in and sat in the chair across from him. I want to tell you something, William said. Daniel looked at him with careful attention. The attention of a teenager who has learned not to assume what a parent's serious tone is leading to. William told him about Lydia. Not everything. Not all the details of the hospital visits and the finance room and the debt she had signed herself into. But the shape of it. Her brother. The illness. The cost. The fact that she had been carrying it entirely alone without saying a word to anyone in the house. Daniel listened without interrupting. When William finished, the boy was quiet for a moment. She comes in every day, and she just works, Daniel said slowly. Like everything is fine. Yes, because she doesn't want anyone to know. That's my read of it. Daniel looked at the dark television screen. That's kind of, he stopped. Started again. That's a lot to carry by yourself. It is. What are you going to do? I'm going to fund a research program that can treat him, William said. Through my foundation, anonymously. The hospital will be told a private donor stepped forward. Lydia won't know where it came from. Daniel absorbed this. Why anonymous? William considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, because his son had asked it with real curiosity, not challenge. Because if she knows it came from me, she'll spend energy trying to find a way to repay it. She'll feel indebted. That isn't what this is. Daniel nodded slowly, and in his expression William saw something he hadn't seen there in a long time, a kind of uncomplicated respect, not the complicated, slightly resentful acknowledgement of a teenager whose parent has done something irritatingly right. Something simpler than that. Can I help? Daniel asked. Dr. Voss read the term sheet carefully. He read it twice. Then he looked up. Why? He asked simply. It was the question William had expected, and the one he found most difficult to answer in a way that was complete without being too much. I lost my wife to a neurological illness 3 years ago, he said. We had every resource available. It wasn't enough because we ran out of time. I'm in a position to make sure someone else doesn't run out of time, and there's a specific someone in mind. He paused. Beyond that, the science is real. The program deserves to exist on stable ground. Both things are true. Dr. Voss looked at the term sheet again for a moment. Then he picked up a pen and initialed the first page. The full agreement took another 3 hours to finalize between the lawyers on both sides. But the essential commitment was made in that moment across the conference table in Boston on a cold Wednesday afternoon in November, between a billionaire who had never found a use for his grief and a researcher who had spent a decade trying to treat the disease that had caused it. William flew back to Chicago that evening. On Thursday morning, he had a brief call with Dr. Carter. She confirmed that the program approval process could be expedited given the urgency of Marcus's situation and the nature of the funding structure. The hospital would inform the family that a private donor had funded an expansion of the research program and that Marcus had been approved for treatment. The donor would not be named. The paperwork would route through the foundation. There would be no direct line from William Harrington to Marcus Brooks's treatment file. And the family will be told nothing about the source? Dr. Carter asked. Nothing, William confirmed. They'll know it was a private donor. That's all. He spent Thursday afternoon at his desk and thought about Lydia, about the appointment she had at the debt consolidation service that day, the appointment that was now pointless, that she didn't yet know was pointless, about the weeks she had spent arriving at this mansion every morning carrying a weight that no one here had known she was carrying. He thought about her voice in the corridor, saying, "Please, just keep him stable," about her kneeling beside her brother's bed, about her face at the moment she had signed the paper in the finance room. He thought about Daniel asking, "Can I help?" and about how differently those two words had landed coming from his son than they might have if William had managed to say them himself at any point in the previous 3 years. He had not been a man who helped in the ordinary sense of that word. He had solved problems and deployed resources and managed situations, but helping, the kind that required you to actually let another person's reality press against yours and change something in you, was different. He had not done much of that. He was doing it now, and he was doing it with his son beside him, which was something he had not fully anticipated when he made the calls that first night. Late Thursday evening, Daniel knocked on the study door and came in. He sat across from his father the way he had sat on Sunday, without preamble or positioning. "Did it work?" he asked. "The Boston thing?" "It's done," William said. "The hospital will contact Marcus's family within the next few days. Treatment can begin within 2 weeks." Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then, "She's going to find out it was you eventually." "Probably. What will you say?" William looked at the window, at the dark garden, and the frost beginning on the glass. He thought about what he would say, and he found that for once he was not entirely sure. He had planned this carefully, methodically, the way he planned everything. But what came after, the part where Lydia looked at him across whatever space separated them and understood what had happened, that part he hadn't scripted. "I'll tell her the truth," he said finally. Daniel nodded. He seemed to find this sufficient. He stood up to leave, and then he paused at the door. "Dad," he said. William looked at him. This was the right thing to do. It was a simple sentence. The kind a person says when they have no doubt about what they mean. William heard it land somewhere he hadn't expected, and he didn't answer because he didn't need to, because the thing his son had just given him, uncomplicated and direct and freely offered, was worth more than any answer he could have found. Daniel left. The study was quiet. William sat at his desk for a while longer in the lamplight, thinking about what the next few days would bring. Lydia receiving the news. Marcus beginning treatment. The particular shape of the lie by omission that he was maintaining, and the knowledge that it had an expiration date he couldn't fully control. Somewhere across the city, in a public hospital on the south side, a young man was sleeping with machines tracking his heartbeat, not knowing that the threat that had been closing around him for months had just been quietly moved out of his path by the employer of the woman who sat beside his bed and held his hand and told him she was fine when she wasn't. William turned off the lamp on his desk. He sat for a moment in the dark. Then he went to find his son. The call came on a Tuesday morning. Lydia was in the middle of polishing the brass fixtures in the second-floor hallway when her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. She almost didn't answer it. She was in the middle of a section and preferred to finish before stopping. But the number on the screen was Mercy General's main line, and she had learned a long time ago never to let that number ring out. She stepped into the small alcove near the linen closet and answered. The voice on the other end was calm and professional, a patient coordinator named Sandra, whom Lydia had spoken with many times over the past several months. But the words Sandra was saying were not the kind of words Lydia had come to associate with those calls. They were not words about balances due or appointments to reschedule or new complications requiring discussion. They were different words entirely, and Lydia had to ask Sandra to repeat herself twice before her mind accepted them. Marcus had been approved for the Voss treatment program. A private donor had stepped forward and funded a significant expansion of the research initiative. Several new patient slots had been made available. Given the urgency of Marcus's case and the recommendation of Dr. Carter, he had been placed at the top of the list. Treatment could begin within the week if Lydia consented. Lydia stood in the alcove beside the linen closet with her back against the wall and said nothing for a moment that stretched long enough that Sandra asked if she was still there. "I'm here," Lydia said. "I'm sorry. Can you tell me again who funded it?" "A private donor," Sandra said. "The hospital isn't at liberty to share that information. What I can tell you is that the funding is real, the program is fully supported, and Marcus's treatment costs are covered in their entirety." "In their entirety," Lydia repeated. "Yes, Ms. Brooks. Completely." After she ended the call, Lydia stood in the alcove for another 2 minutes without moving. The brass polishing cloth was still in her hand. She looked at it as if she had briefly forgotten what it was for. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her apron pocket beside her phone. And she walked to the bathroom at the end of the hall and ran cold water over her wrists and pressed her palms flat against the cool edge of the sink. She didn't let herself cry. Not here. Not in this house. She would get through the rest of the day, and she would go to the hospital that evening, and she would sit with Marcus and tell him. And then she could fall apart as much as she needed to. She went back to the brass fixtures and finished the section. William was in a meeting call in his study when he saw Lydia through the window, crossing the back garden on her way to the outdoor storage room. She walked the same path she always walked, the same measured pace, the same posture. Nothing about her appearance had changed. But when she came back across the garden a few minutes later, carrying the cleaning supplies she had gone for, she paused for just a moment near the stone bench by the far hedge. She stood there for 2 or 3 seconds with her face tilted slightly upward toward the gray November sky. Then she continued back to the house. William returned his attention to the call and said nothing. That evening he arrived at the hospital after Lydia did. He came in through a side entrance he had learned about during his previous visits and found a position in the waiting area near the elevator that gave him a partial sight line to the hallway outside Marcus's room. He wasn't there to intervene or observe closely. He wasn't entirely sure why he was there, except that it felt important to witness this. Not the transaction of it, not the medical procedure, but the moment between a brother and sister when the news became real. He couldn't hear them. The door was closed, and the hallway carried only silence. But through the narrow glass panel, he could see Lydia sitting in the chair beside Marcus's bed, leaning forward, talking. And he could see Marcus's face, animated in a way it hadn't been on the previous occasions William had glimpsed him through that same panel. His hands were moving as he spoke, the particular gesturing of someone who has just been handed back a future they had begun to let go of. At one point, Marcus reached out and took both of Lydia's hands in his and held them. She let him. She bowed her head for a moment, and when she raised it again, her face was wet. William looked away. He stayed another 10 minutes and then left quietly. The first stage of the treatment was scheduled for that Friday. It was a long procedure, preparatory work that the medical team needed to complete before the primary protocol could begin, and it ran from 7 in the morning until nearly 5 in the evening. Lydia arrived at the hospital before the sun came up. William knew this because Daniel told him, having stopped at Mercy General on the way to school after asking the evening before whether he could. William had said yes without hesitation. Daniel came home that afternoon and found his father in the kitchen, which was unusual. William rarely spent time in the kitchen outside of meals. He was standing at the counter with a cup of tea that had gone cold, not reading the documents in front of him. "She's been in the waiting room the whole time," Daniel said, setting his bag on the chair. "She won't go to the cafeteria. One of the nurses brought her something to eat around noon, and she barely touched it." William nodded. "Dad," Daniel paused. "Is Marcus going to be okay?" "Dr. Carter thinks the early indicators are strong," William said carefully. "But it's going to take time. Daniel pulled out the chair and sat down. She looked really scared. "She's been scared for months," William said. "This is the first day she's been scared with a reason to hope." Daniel considered this. "That's almost harder," he said quietly, with the particular insight of a teenager who understood more about the texture of grief than most adults gave him credit for. When you're used to things being bad, and then suddenly maybe they won't be, that feels more dangerous somehow. William looked at his son. "Yes," he said, "that's exactly what it feels like." They sat together in the kitchen while the tea went cold and the light outside the windows shifted from afternoon gray to early dark, and neither of them felt the need to fill the silence. The surgery ran 40 minutes longer than projected. William received a text from Daniel at 4:18 that said still waiting, and another at 5:02 that said doctor just came out. He was in the car in the hospital parking lot by 5:30, having driven over without fully deciding to. Dr. Carter had already given Lydia the summary by the time William arrived on the ward. He learned the result from the duty nurse near the station, who mentioned it in passing to a colleague while William waited near the elevator. The procedure had been successful, the progression halted, recovery uncertain, but the prognosis meaningfully improved. He found a chair in the far waiting area and sat there until the ward quieted down around him. At some point, through the half-open door of the family waiting room, he heard Lydia's voice, not distressed, not crying, but talking quietly on the phone with what sounded like genuine steadiness, telling someone that it had gone well, that Marcus was awake, that he had looked at her and made a joke about the hospital food, which apparently meant he was going to be fine. William sat in the plastic chair in the dim waiting area and felt something settle in his chest. Not pride, exactly. He hadn't done anything that deserved pride in the way he usually thought about it. What he felt was simpler and less self-referential than that. It was closer to relief. The particular relief of a person who has spent years carrying something heavy and has finally set a piece of it down. He drove home in the dark and slept better than he had in months. Marcus's recovery did not move in a straight line, but it moved. In the 2 weeks after the first procedure, there were days that were harder than others. Days when his nerve responses tested lower than hoped, and the medical team recalibrated their timeline with careful, measured language that never quite committed to an outcome. But there were also days when the numbers moved in the right direction, and those days began to outnumber the difficult ones with a consistency that Dr. Carter described, with professional restraint, as genuinely encouraging. Lydia returned to work at the mansion the Monday after the surgery. William had half expected she might take more time. The hospital would have supported it, and she had been running on almost nothing for months. But she arrived at the regular time, in her uniform, and went directly to her morning tasks without any indication that the past week had been anything other than ordinary. She mentioned to Patricia, the housekeeper, that her brother was recovering from a medical procedure and that she appreciated everyone's patience with her schedule adjustments. She said it plainly, without drama, in the same tone she might have used to explain a change in the cleaning supply inventory. Patricia relayed this to William later that day in her brief end-of-morning report. He nodded and said nothing. He continued to behave around Lydia exactly as he always had, polite, distracted, professionally removed. He gave her no indication that anything had changed in his understanding of her situation, asked no questions, made no references. When they passed each other in hallways, or she came to clean a room he was occupying, the interaction was identical to every interaction they had shared over the previous 2 years. He told himself, protecting the integrity of what he had done. The anonymity wasn't just a condition he had set for himself. It was a form of respect. Lydia's pride was not a small thing. He had observed that clearly enough. If she knew, the entire architecture of what he had given her would shift. It would become something she owed, and Lydia Brooks was not a person who would carry an unpaid debt with any comfort. So he said nothing, and Lydia worked, and Marcus recovered. It was Daniel who changed the atmosphere in the house. After the Tuesday evening conversation in the kitchen, something in Daniel had quietly rearranged itself. He had always been polite to the staff in the automatic, slightly unconscious way of a teenager who had grown up around household employees. They were present, they were courteous to each other, They occupied the same space without genuinely sharing it. That changed with Lydia. He started small. He said good morning to her specifically, using her name rather than the general acknowledgement he gave the rest of the staff. He asked her once, when he encountered her in the kitchen, whether her brother was doing better. She looked mildly surprised by the question, but answered honestly that he was improving, that it was still early, that she was hopeful. "That's really good," Daniel said simply. "I'm glad." He meant it in the uncomplicated way that teenagers mean things when they haven't yet learned to perform sincerity, and Lydia clearly recognized that, because something in her posture eased slightly, the habitual containment loosening just a fraction. After that, the conversations became more frequent and less surprising to either of them. Daniel asked about Marcus's interests, how old he was, what he was like. Lydia told him, carefully at first, then with more ease, about her brother's sharpness, his humor, the way he could light up a room without trying. She told Daniel about the hospital visits, how she always brought Marcus crossword puzzles because the neurologist said sustained mental activity was beneficial, and how Marcus always did them wrong on purpose just to make her argue with him about the answers. Daniel laughed at that. A real laugh. The kind that came out before he remembered to be reserved. He started going to the hospital on Saturday mornings. William found out about this on the third Saturday, when Daniel mentioned it at dinner. Not seeking permission or approval, just describing his day in the ordinary way. He had gone to see how Marcus was doing. They had talked for a while. Marcus had opinions about everything and was easy to talk to. He was going back next week. William listened to this and thought about the fact that his son, who had been sealed off from the world in the particular way of a grieving teenager for 3 years, was spending his Saturday mornings sitting with a young man he barely knew in a hospital recovery room, apparently because he wanted to. "How is he?" William asked. "He's getting stronger," Daniel said. "He asked me about you." William looked up. "About me? He doesn't know who you are. He just knows I live somewhere with a lot of staff." Daniel picked up his fork. "I didn't tell him anything." "Good," William said. And then, because it was true, "Thank you." The hospital, meanwhile, had its own internal weather. Institutions of that size moved information the way large buildings moved air through systems that were never perfectly sealed. What had begun as an administrative note about an anonymous donor funding a research program expansion had become, over the course of 2 weeks, something considerably more discussed. The Voss protocol was not a small contribution. The number attached to it had circulated among department heads and administrators who were not bound by the same discretion protocols as the clinical staff. Names had not been officially disclosed, but in the informal economy of hospital conversation, lunch tables, corridor exchanges, the particular candor that medical professionals allowed themselves in private, speculation had begun. Lydia heard most of it filtered through noise and indirection. A nurse mentioned in passing that the donor was apparently a major Chicago figure. An administrator who passed her in the hallway near the finance office made a comment about the foundation paperwork moving through the system, something about a Midwest-based technology company. Lydia absorbed these fragments without paying them close attention. She had more important things occupying her mind. But then one afternoon, she was speaking with Thomas, the hospital's patient services coordinator, about updating Marcus's insurance documentation. Thomas was a pleasant, slightly disorganized man who talked more than his job required, which was usually a minor inconvenience, but occasionally useful. He was flipping through a printed email chain looking for a form number when he glanced at the header of one of the pages and said, without any particular awareness of what he was saying, "Here it is. Foundation transfer, Harrington Technologies." Now where did I put the form? He found the form. He handed it to Lydia. He moved on. Lydia looked at the form in her hand. Harrington Technologies. She knew that name. Of course she knew that name. It was on the letterhead in the office she cleaned 3 times a week. It was on the plaques in the entrance hall of the mansion. It was the name of the company built by the man who signed her paychecks. She stood at the coordinator's desk for a moment with the form in her hand and the specific stillness of someone whose mind is moving very quickly while their body stays completely still. She told herself it was a coincidence. Chicago was full of large companies. Technology was a broad category. Harrington was not an uncommon name. The anonymous donor could be any one of dozens of people at that level of wealth in the greater metropolitan area. But the timeline sat in her mind and would not leave it alone. She thought about the exact sequence of events. The donor had come forward suddenly, without warning, at a moment when Marcus's situation had been deteriorating rapidly and her own financial options had nearly run out. The treatment had been approved within days. The funding had moved fast, unusually fast for a philanthropic commitment of that scale, which typically moved through committees and review processes over months, not days. Someone had pushed it through. Someone with leverage inside the system. Someone who knew. She went home that night and sat at her kitchen table for a long time. She thought about every interaction she had had with William Harrington over the past 2 months. The way he had looked at her sometimes, not unkindly, but with a focus that went slightly beyond the distracted acknowledgement he gave most things. The evening in the corridor when she had been on the phone and he had been standing there close enough to hear her voice. The afternoon she had dropped the glass in his office and left without finishing her work, and he had simply said go, without question, without the irritation she had braced for. Small things she had filed away and not examined closely. She pulled them out now and looked at them in sequence. Her stomach tightened. She thought about the debt consolidation appointment she had gone to on that Thursday, the one where she had sat across from a financial counselor and begun calculating what the next 20 years of repayment might look like, and how 2 days later the hospital had called to tell her the entire situation had changed. The timing was so close it almost embarrassed her for not having seen it sooner. She sat at the table until past midnight. Then she went to bed and stared at the ceiling. She almost didn't bring it up. For 2 full days she went back and forth inside herself, constructing arguments on both sides. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe the name was a coincidence, and she was assembling a story from fragments that didn't actually connect. Raising it with him and being wrong would be humiliating in a way that felt professionally damaging. She needed this job. She had always needed this job, and creating an awkward situation based on a misreading would be difficult to recover from. But by Thursday evening, the question had become too large to carry quietly. She had been placing fresh flowers in the entrance hall, one of the end-of-week tasks she completed before leaving, when she heard William's study door open and his footsteps in the corridor. She had about 30 seconds to decide. She kept her hands moving on the flower arrangement and said, without looking up, "Mr. Harrington, could I speak with you for a moment when you have a chance?" He stopped. Of course. She turned around. He was standing in the corridor looking at her with the calm, attentive expression he always had. She had read that expression as neutral for 2 years. She wasn't entirely sure now what it was. She held herself straight. Her voice, when it came out, was steady. "Sir," she said quietly, "were you the one who helped my brother?" The entrance hall went very quiet around them. The fresh flowers stood in their vase. The light from the corridor lamp fell across the floor in its usual way. Everything was the same as it always was in this house. And yet the air had shifted in the particular way it shifts when a question that cannot be unasked has finally been asked. William looked at her for a long moment. He didn't look away. He didn't look surprised. He looked like a man standing in the place he had known the conversation would eventually reach, who had decided somewhere along the way to meet it without maneuvering. He said nothing yet, but in the silence that followed her question, Lydia watched his expression, and in it she found the answer before he spoke a single word. The silence lasted longer than silences usually do. Not the uncomfortable kind, not the silence of someone caught in something they wanted to escape. William stood in the corridor of his entrance hall with the lamplight falling across the floor between them, and said nothing for what felt to Lydia like a very long time, and the quality of that silence was the quality of a man who was deciding not how to answer, but how much of the truth to give and in what order. Lydia waited. She had asked the question with steadiness, and she would receive whatever came next with the same. Finally, William said, "Why don't you come into the study?" It wasn't a deflection. It was the response of a man who understood that what he was about to say deserved more than a corridor. She followed him in. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. The same chair his lawyers sat in, the the same chair his business partner sat in when they came to the house. She sat. He didn't go behind a desk. He stood near the window with his arms loose at his sides, looking out at the garden for a moment before turning to face her. "Yes," he said. "I was." Lydia had already known it from his expression in the hallway. Hearing it spoken was still different. Her hands, folded in her lap, pressed together slightly. "I funded the research program," William continued. "Through my foundation, I arranged for Dr. Carter to expedite Marcus's approval. The treatment costs are fully covered. Not just the current course, the entire program is endowed. It won't run out of money." He paused. "You don't owe me anything. That isn't why I did it, and I want to be very clear about that before you say anything else." Lydia looked at him. There were things forming inside her, gratitude and confusion and something harder to name, something that had to do with the strangeness of discovering that the person responsible for the most significant thing that had ever happened to her was someone she had worked beside for 2 years without knowing any of this about him. "How did you know?" she asked. "About Marcus." William was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I followed you." She hadn't expected that. Her expression changed slightly. "The night you left the office in a hurry, when you dropped the glass," he said, "I followed your car to the hospital. I want to be honest about that, because you deserve to know the full picture, not a version of it that make me look better than I was." He didn't offer excuses. He stated it plainly, with the directness of a man who had decided some time ago that when this moment came he would not manage it. "I went back several times after that. I saw Marcus through the window of his room. I heard you with the hospital administrator talking about the treatment costs. I was there the night you went to the finance department and signed the debt consolidation agreement." Lydia sat very still. "You watched all of that?" "Yes." "And you didn't say anything?" "No." She looked at the window briefly, then back at him. "Why not?" He considered this with the same careful honesty he had brought to everything else. "At first, I wasn't sure what I was going to do. I needed to understand the situation before I understood what my role in it should be, if any." He moved away from the window and sat in the chair beside, rather than behind the desk, a smaller distance than the desk would have created. "And then when I decided to act, I didn't tell you, because I knew if you were aware it came from me, you would have felt you couldn't accept it, or you would have accepted it and spent years feeling indebted. I didn't want that." Lydia was quiet for a moment. She looked at her hands, then up at him. "That's a very considered way to help someone," she said. Her voice was not sharp. It was more like the voice of someone genuinely working something out. "I'm a considered person," William said, "for better and worse." Something shifted in her expression, not softening exactly, but a kind of recognition. She had worked in this house long enough to understand the architecture of the man in front of her. The control, the observation, the tendency to manage situations through information rather than presence. She had read all of it as coldness for 2 years. She was revising that reading now, and the revision was complicated. "Can I ask you something else?" she said. "Yes." "Why Marcus? You have resources. You could fund anything. There are research programs and hospitals and causes everywhere. Why this one?" William's jaw shifted slightly. He looked at the window again, not avoiding her eyes, but the particular look of someone reaching for something that doesn't have easy footing. "My wife," he said. "Eleanor. She died 3 years ago from a neurological illness. Different from Marcus's condition in the mechanics, but the same category of enemy, the kind that works against the body's own nervous system." He paused. "We had every advantage. The best doctors, the best programs. I spent more money on her treatment than most people will earn in 10 lifetimes, and none of it was enough because we were too late. The research wasn't there yet." He looked back at Lydia. "When I understood what Marcus had, and that the research existed that could help him, and that the only reason he might not receive it was money, I couldn't look away from that. I've had to look away from a lot of things in my life. That wasn't one I was willing to add to the list." Lydia heard this and said nothing for a long moment. She had built a picture of William Harrington over 2 years from observable evidence: the controlled household, the precise schedules, the emotional distance he maintained from everything and everyone around him, including his own son. She had placed him in a category of person she understood well. Powerful, insulated, operating in a world so far from her own that their daily proximity was essentially incidental. A man whose life she moved through without touching and who moved through hers the same way. None of that had prepared her for this. "I'm sorry about your wife," she said. It was simple, and she meant it entirely. William nodded once. "Thank you. I don't know how to," she started, and then stopped. She pressed her lips together briefly. "There isn't a word for what you gave my brother. What you gave me. I've been trying to find the right one since I sat down in this chair, and I don't think it exists." "You don't need to find one," William said. "I know I don't need to," she said, with a quiet firmness that was entirely her. "I want to." She didn't cry. He had half expected she might, and he would not have judged it. He had seen enough of what she had carried to know the tears were fully earned. But Lydia Brooks, apparently, chose her moments carefully, and this was not one she had selected for falling apart. She sat in the chair across from him with her back straight, and her hands steady, and looked at him with an expression that was gratitude and grief and relief and something else. Something that looked like the specific exhaustion of a person who has been braced for the worst for so long that learning the worst is not coming takes a moment to become real. "He's going to walk again," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. It was something she was saying aloud, because saying it aloud was the only way to make it fully true. Dr. Carter said last week his nerve function is coming back. She said the rate of recovery is beyond what they projected. "I heard," William said. "She called me." Lydia looked at him. "She's been updating you." "I asked her to. I wanted to know he was all right." He paused. "I should have told you that. I'm telling you now." Lydia absorbed this. Then she said, with a small and genuine smile that changed her face in a way William had never seen directed at him before, "You've been very busy watching over people who didn't know you were watching." "Old habit," he said. "I noticed," she said. "I just didn't know what I was seeing." They sat together in the study for a while longer, and the conversation moved into smaller, quieter territory. Marcus's progress, the next phase of treatment, what Dr. Carter had said about the timeline for his full recovery. It was the conversation of two people recalibrating the terms of how they knew each other, finding the new footing carefully. When Lydia stood to leave, she paused at the door. "Mr. Harrington," she said. He looked at her. "Daniel came to see Marcus last Saturday," she said. "Marcus told me afterward that he was one of the best conversations he'd had in months. He said the kid had a good mind and didn't waste it pretending to be less curious than he was." She paused. "I thought you should know that." William said nothing, but something moved in his expression. Lydia left. He sat in the study for a long time after she was gone. 3 weeks after the conversation in the study, Marcus Brooks walked the length of the hospital hallway under his own power for the first time in 14 months. It was not dramatic in the way such moments are sometimes depicted. He was slow, and he needed the rail on one side, and he stopped twice to let his nervous system recalibrate. But his feet were under him, and he was moving, and Dr. Carter stood at the end of the hallway with the restrained expression of a physician who has trained herself not to celebrate prematurely and was working hard to maintain that training. Lydia walked beside him without touching him, close enough to catch him if needed, staying back enough to let him do it himself. He reached the end of the hallway and stopped and looked at his sister and said, in the voice of a young man who had spent 14 months fighting for exactly this moment, "Told you I wasn't dead yet." Lydia covered her face with both hands. Marcus laughed. Dr. Carter allowed herself a smile. The story might have rested there. A private miracle in a public hospital on the south side of Chicago, witnessed by the people it mattered to and unknown to anyone else. But institutions don't hold stories the way individuals do. The Voss program's results were significant enough that Dr. Voss's team published preliminary data in a medical research journal 6 weeks after Marcus's first successful walk. The publication noted that the program had recently received a major private endowment that had allowed it to expand its patient cohort. It did not name the donor. A medical reporter at a Chicago newspaper read the publication and recognized the significance of the result. She made calls. She spoke to hospital administrators and research staff and followed the foundation paperwork through the channels it had traveled. The name Harrington Technologies appeared in her notes on a Tuesday afternoon, and by Thursday, she had enough to write a story. William received a call from his PR director on Friday morning asking how he wanted to handle it. "Tell them the truth," William said. "Don't embellish it and don't minimize it. Tell them a private donor funded a research program. Tell them the program is producing results. If they want a comment from me directly, I'll give them one." The story ran the following Monday in the Tribune's business section and was picked up by 2 national outlets by Wednesday. The headline was straightforward: Chicago billionaires' anonymous donation funds breakthrough neurological treatment. The piece was accurate and, to William's mild surprise, generous. It focused primarily on the research itself and the patients who had benefited, with his involvement framed as the mechanism rather than the subject. He read it once and set it aside. What he thought about more than the story was a conversation he'd had the previous Sunday, when he and Daniel had driven together to Mercy General. Marcus had been sitting up in bed, working on a crossword puzzle when they arrived, a half-finished one, which Daniel immediately pointed out was unusual given what Lydia had said about his abilities. "I'm taking it easy," Marcus said. "I'm convalescent." "You're sitting up perfectly straight, and you've finished the top half in pen," Daniel said. "Atmosphere," Marcus said. "I'm creating atmosphere." William had stood near the window, while Daniel and Marcus argued about the crossword in the comfortable way of 2 people who had developed a shorthand, and he had watched his son, animated, quick, genuinely engaged, and understood that something in Daniel had come back to life in this room, in the company of this particular person. Marcus had looked at William at one point during the visit with the direct, assessing attention of someone who didn't waste his observations, and said, "You're quieter than I expected." "What did you expect?" William asked. Marcus had considered this with real thought. "Someone who fills rooms," he said. "Most people with that much," he gestured vaguely, indicating weight, influence. "They push. You just stand there and the room adjusts around you." William hadn't known what to say to that. Is that a compliment? Still deciding, Marcus said cheerfully and went back to the crossword. Daniel had caught his father's eye across the room and very nearly smiled. The foundation took its formal shape in January. William had been working on the structure since November, but he had wanted the legal framework to be complete and the funding architecture to be properly established before announcing anything publicly. The Harrington Institute for Neurological Research was incorporated as an independent nonprofit with a board of directors that included Dr. Voss, Dr. Carter, 2 patient advocates, and a research administrator from university with no prior connection to Harrington Technologies. Williams served as founding chairman. The mission was specific: to fund neurological disease treatment for patients who could not access it through standard insurance or public health channels. Not a general research fund. Not a broad charitable arm. A program designed to do precisely what it had done for Marcus: identify cases where effective treatment existed but financial access did not, and remove the barrier. He announced it at a small press event in the Foundation's new office space, a converted floor of a building in the West Loop. He spoke for 7 minutes. He described Eleanor's illness without excessive detail, because it was relevant to the origin of the Foundation, and omitting it would have been a kind of dishonesty. He described the research program and its results. He said that the first patient whose case had prompted the Foundation's creation was recovering well and had recently been offered a position on the research team. He did not use any names. Lydia was not at the press event. She had asked not to be, and he had respected that entirely. She had her own relationship with what had happened, and she was managing it on her own terms. That was as it should be. Her new role at the Foundation had been William's idea, offered without pressure and accepted after a week of consideration. She now worked 3 days a week as a patient support coordinator, the person that families in crisis called when they needed someone who understood not just the logistical dimensions of what they were facing, but the human ones. She kept 2 days a week at the mansion because she had asked to, and William had understood without needing it explained that the continuity mattered to her. The first family she worked with was a woman from the South Side named Renee, whose teenage daughter had been diagnosed with a progressive motor neuron condition 4 months earlier. Lydia sat with Renee in the Foundation's small consultation room for nearly 2 hours on a Tuesday afternoon. She explained the application process for treatment funding, the timeline, what the family could expect from the hospital and from the research team. She was clear and specific and did not soften things that shouldn't be softened. At the end of the meeting, Renee said, "How do you know all of this?" Lydia said, "Because my brother went through it." Renee looked at her. "He's all right now," Lydia said. "I want you to know that because I remember being exactly where you are, and I needed someone to tell me it was possible for it to turn out all right." She paused. "It's possible." Renee pressed her hands flat on the table and nodded. Marcus joined Dr. Voss's research team in February. It was not a formal research position. He was completing his undergraduate degree remotely, which the illness had interrupted 2 years earlier, and the arrangement was structured as a research assistantship that would transition into a formal role once he graduated. But from the first week, it was clear that the transition was a formality. Dr. Voss sent William an email after Marcus's first week that said, in its entirety, "Your foundation's first patient is going to be one of the people who cures this disease. Thought you should know." William forwarded the email to Lydia without comment. She replied with a single sentence, "I always knew." Daniel graduated from his difficult 16 into a somewhat less difficult 17 with the assistance of several Saturday mornings at Mercy General and one memorable afternoon when Marcus, fully ambulatory and characteristically forthright, had told him that the reason Daniel found school tedious was probably that he wasn't being challenged enough and that he should do something about it rather than coasting. Daniel had apparently found this more useful than anything a school counselor had told him in 3 years. He started a mathematics enrichment program at a university extension and stopped leaving dinner early to go to his room. William noticed. He said nothing about it directly, because Daniel was at an age where direct acknowledgement of personal progress tended to produce embarrassment and retreat. But on a Saturday morning, when Daniel came downstairs ready for a hospital visit and found his father already in the kitchen putting on his coat, the look that passed between them was sufficient. "You're coming," Daniel said. "I thought I might." They drove together. The conversation in the car was about Marcus's research work, which Daniel had been following closely enough to have opinions about it, and about the Foundation's second approved patient, a man in his 50s from the northern suburbs whose case had come to them through a referral from Mercy General. William answered Daniel's questions with the directness he brought to everything, without calibrating for his son's age, and Daniel asked them with the seriousness of someone who had decided that the world was more interesting than he had been crediting it with. The hospital visit was easy and warm in the way their visits had become. Marcus was in the outpatient wing now, no longer a patient in the formal sense, but present most days for the research work and apparently also for the social dimension, which he engaged with without apology. He had opinions about everything, a memory for the names of everyone he had met, and a talent for making people feel that talking to him was time well spent. Dr. Carter found William in the hallway near the end of the visit. She was a woman who expressed professional satisfaction with subtlety, a slightly less guarded tone, a straightness of posture that indicated ease rather than performance. She thanked him directly, without preamble, for what the Foundation had made possible. She described 3 cases currently in the pipeline and what the outcomes were expected to be. She talked about the research team's work and what the next 18 months might produce. William listened to all of it. "You built something real," she said at the end. "I've seen a lot of philanthropic initiatives in this field. Most of them are well-intentioned and structurally fragile. What you've built is designed to last." "It's designed to work," William said. "Lasting is what happens when something works." Dr. Carter nodded. "Fair enough." She moved off down the corridor in the brisk, purposeful way of someone with 11 other things requiring attention. William stood for a moment in the hallway outside the room, where Marcus was now talking animatedly with Daniel about something on a tablet between them. He thought about what he had said to Dr. Carter and understood that it was true not just of the Foundation, but of something else. The relationship he was slowly, carefully, without fanfare rebuilding with his son. The changed terms on which he moved through his own house. The fact that on most evenings now, he closed his laptop at 7 and ate dinner at the table. And that this had begun because a 16-year-old had looked at him across a kitchen and asked a simple question about a woman who cleaned their house and what her brother needed. Small pivots, enormous trajectories. On an afternoon in late March, Lydia returned to Mercy General for a foundation meeting with the hospital's patient services department. She arrived early and walked through the main building to the neurology ward. The route she had taken dozens of times in the worst months, through the lobby, past the elevators, down the second-floor corridor to the ward entrance. She walked it slowly this time, not because anything was wrong, but because she wanted to be in it differently than she had always been in it before. She had only ever walked that corridor in the grip of something. Urgency, fear, the particular focused dread of someone managing a crisis. She had never simply walked it. She walked it now and let it be what it was. A hospital hallway, linoleum floors, and overhead lighting, and the particular smell of institutional cleanliness. Nothing remarkable, nothing frightening. At the end of the corridor, near the family waiting area where she had spent so many hours, she stopped. She stood there for a moment. She thought about the night she had stood in almost this exact spot with a cracked phone screen and shaking hands, trying to hold herself together while Marcus was in surgery and the numbers she owed were stacking up in the back of her mind, and she had believed, in the way a person believes things at 3 in the morning when they're alone and exhausted, that she was not going to be able to hold all of it, that something was going to give. She had been wrong. Something had given, but it wasn't her. Footsteps behind her. She turned. Marcus was walking down the corridor toward her in the unhurried way he moved now. Not perfectly. There was still a slight irregularity in his gait that Dr. Carter said might or might not resolve fully over time, but upright and easy and entirely his own. He was wearing the research team's lanyard around his neck and carrying a coffee cup, and he was smiling in the way he always smiled, as if the world was generally a more interesting place than it had any obligation to be. "You're early," he said. "I wanted to walk the hall," she said. He looked at her, understanding what she meant without needing it elaborated. He stepped up beside her, and they stood together for a moment at the end of the corridor, looking back down its length. "Different now," he said. "Yes." He put his arm around her shoulders briefly, and then they both started walking, forward, away from the waiting area, toward the meeting room and the work that was waiting. His footsteps were steady on the linoleum. Hers were too. The evening of the Foundation's first public gala, a fundraising event in April that William had agreed to host only after extended persuasion from his board. He stood briefly alone near the windows of the event space before the guests arrived, looking out at the lit-up city below. Lydia found him there. She had a glass of water in her hand and was wearing a deep blue dress rather than a uniform, which still looked slightly unfamiliar on her in this context, and she stood beside him at the window for a moment before saying anything. "Marcus is giving a speech tonight," she said. "I know. Dr. Voss sent me the draft. It's good. He's been practicing it on me for a week," she said. "I've heard it 11 times. Is it still good?" "It's better every time," she admitted. They stood at the window in the comfortable quiet of two people who had arrived at an understanding of each other that didn't require constant maintenance. "Mr. Harrington," Lydia said. He looked at her. She looked back at him with a directness that was entirely hers, steady, clear, without performance. "The night you followed me to that hospital," she said, "I've thought about it a lot, whether I should feel strange about it." "That would be reasonable," he said. "I did for a while," she said. "And then I thought about what came after, and I decided that the way a thing starts doesn't always define what it becomes." She paused. "You could have walked away. You had enough information to know it wasn't your problem, and you walked back to your car and you drove home, and then you made it your problem anyway." She looked out at the city. "I don't know many people who would do that." William said nothing. "So," she said simply, "thank you. Again. For the last time, probably, because I think we've both said enough on the subject." "Agreed," he said. Below them, the city moved in its ordinary, indifferent way. Traffic and lights, and the 10,000 private stories that any city contained at any given moment, most of them invisible to everyone except the person living inside them. William looked at it and thought about a parking lot in November and a question he couldn't stop asking himself about what he was going to do, and the answer that had come not from calculation, but from something older and less manageable than calculation. He thought about Eleanor. He thought about Daniel in the kitchen asking a question that unlocked something. He thought about a young man walking down a hospital hallway for the first time in 14 months and saying, "Told you I wasn't dead yet." He thought about Lydia standing in this same city months ago, crying quietly in a hospital corridor, believing she was alone. The guests were arriving, voices and movement behind them, the specific energy of a room filling with people who had come to be part of something. Marcus's voice somewhere near the entrance, animated and carrying easily over the crowd, already in conversation with someone he had apparently just met and already making them laugh. William turned from the window. There was work to do. How many people around you are quietly drowning while you assume they're fine? And what would it cost you to simply pay attention? If this story moved you, hit like and subscribe. We have more coming that will stay with you long after they end.